Welcome to the Surviving Siblings podcast. I'm your host, Maya Roffler. As a surviving sibling myself, I knew that I wanted to share my story, my brother's story. I lost my brother to a homicide in November of 2016, and after going through this experience, I knew that I wanted to share my story and his story. It's time to share your stories now. The forgotten mourners, the surviving siblings, the story that is not told enough. Season 3 of the Surviving Siblings podcast is brought to you by sibsforever.org, a virtual platform for you, the surviving sibling, to commemorate and honor your sibling relationship. Visit sibsforever.org today to create your free profile and start building beautiful commemorative web pages that can include photo and video galleries featuring you and your sibling. Now, let's dive into the episode. I am so excited about our guest today. Her name is Judy Lipson. Judy is an author, a mother, a grandmother, and so many additional things. Judy, welcome to the show.
Maya, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for sharing your story and opening up your heart to others. And congratulations on season 3 of the Surviving Siblings podcast.
You're so kind. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm so excited to be here for season 3, but so excited to share your story, Judy, because we had so many requests after season 1 and 2 for multi-loss stories. And that's something that I can't connect to or share, but I can connect to the loss of a sibling. And you have lost 2 of your sisters. You lost Jane and then Margie. So I'd love to just dive in, Judy, and start telling your story of both of your wonderful sisters. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. So in 1981, I lost my younger sister, Jane, at age 22 in an automobile accident. And it was a real shock. I was 25 at the time. I say now I'm the middle of 3 girls, and that's kind of who I am. And as the middle child, I've kind of lost, I'm the typical middle sister. So Jane was younger and we were very, very different. And then in 1990, I lost my sister Margie at age 35 after a 20-year battle with anorexia and bulimia. And the short story is that I kind of pushed the grief down for 30 years, kind of not believing it and kind of taking care of everybody else, as surviving siblings often do, and worrying about everybody else, that I didn't deal with the grief until 30 years. And then I started a fundraiser in their honor, skating fundraiser, because we all skated. And I think all through those years, I kind of felt like something was off. I'm not a twin, but almost like a limb was missing, like something wasn't right. So I took the journey, and it's almost like I'm a newly bereaved griever after all those years starting again after 30 years. And it was probably the best gift that I could give to myself. And for me, being a private person and sharing my story, I'm grateful that I did. And then I wrote the book, and it's to help other people, but also the wonderful people that have come into my life.
Yeah, and we're going to get into the book a little bit later because I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's incredible, and you're so open and raw and honest. And so I can definitely appreciate that, sharing my own story. And I was kind of giggling as I was listening to the book. And then also as, we have connected when you told me that, you're the middle sister, you've been quite introverted and shy. And I'm like, wow, she's putting her whole story out here now. So that must have been a shift for you, a different experience.
Well, I'm the typical middle child, as I think people can relate to. So Jane was the baby and got all the attention. And naturally, I tell the story how I would hit her and she wouldn't cry until I came into the room, and then I would get into trouble. And Margie was the oldest and, the golden girl. And I always wanted to be like her. And I was kind of the middle and kind of the good girl and kind of did my thing. So, when they were gone, I was like, who was I? Where was I? What do I do? So I just kind of did my thing. And then after they were gone, I'm kind of jumping ahead of the wheel here, but I think when we lose our siblings, we change in so many ways. So here I was, after they're gone, I'm doing this fundraiser and I'm skating in front of like 150 people. Like the shy introvert is like getting out there and performing. So in some ways, would I have been able to do that if, this hadn't happened to me? So, you never know. But in some ways that's, that I changed to be able to do that and honor their memories in a sport that we all loved.
Yeah, I think you brought up a really good point, and then I want to go back to Jane, tell her story, and tell Margie. But you bring up such a really crucial point that I think we don't realize when we're fresh in the grief journey. And as we start to move through our grief journey and process it, which you're mentioning, which is really important because it can be a decade, it can be 20 years, 30 years. But if you haven't processed it, you got to deal with it. And we're going to talk about that. But I think something really key that you said is, I don't know that I would have done this. Maybe tell the story, tell more of yourself, share more of yourself, be skating years later in your life and performing. And I think it's hard for siblings when they first, or any loss really, when you first lose someone, to imagine your life without them. Then as you kind of start to move through it, there's a sadness about it. And then when you do something with the grief, when you, like I've done this podcast, you've done a whole lot, you've written the book, and you also do this amazing fundraiser, that you start to look back and go, I don't know if I would have done this if this didn't happen. And not that you would ever wish this on anyone or say this should happen so that you can be inspired to do these things. But I think it's a really good message for all of the surviving siblings that are listening, that are really early in their grief journey or may have not processed yet, because there is a silver lining to it, even if it doesn't feel like it. That's a big message that you just put out there, Judy.
I say in my book that there's no recipe for grief, and it's never too late to grieve. And it's everybody's journey is unique and whatever feels right. And I guess I didn't feel for so long. And I think now being open, as honest and raw as you were with season 1 in telling your brother's story, the whole story, it was so brave. And I think it's hard, but I think it's so many wonderful people come into your life. And I think it's important that we share our stories because not a lot of siblings do. And then you realize that you're not alone. And I think that's another piece, that I was so alone. I had no one to talk to about it. And I think once you know that you're not alone and you share the story, it feels like a warm blanket coming home, and you've got people around you. And I think that's the piece that I never had. And now that I've opened up and shared my story, I'm just meeting incredible people and other people. And now I can hear it and understand. I'm like, oh my God, that's exactly what I feel. I'm not crazy. Yes, yes, yes. And I'm 40 years out and 41 years and 32 years out. And it doesn't matter whether you're a day out, a month out. It doesn't matter.
So beautifully said. So beautifully said. I agree completely. It's the connection that you have with other surviving siblings is just so deep. Like meeting you, it was amazing. And everybody that listens to this podcast, I hope that's what they feel when they hear this. So I want to go back to your first sister that you lost, Jane, the baby. So tell us a little bit about, I know you divulge a lot in the book, but I want the audience to hear just the basic details behind the loss of Jane to the car accident. This was a tragic loss.
So Jane was 22 and was at a crossroads. She didn't do so well in college and was living at home, was going to community college, was just turned 22 the day before and didn't know what she was going to do with her life, floundering. I was 25, living in New York in Bloomingdale's training program. And Margie had been sick for many, many years and her life had been at bay, at times. So I didn't know, Jane came as a total shock. So I was living in New York and my parents called my aunt to come over with some bogus excuse and the phone rings. And my initial reaction that it was Margie. And I get this call, it's Jane. Total shock. I mean, my mother had just moved me into my New York apartment. She had gone home to take Jane to see Dreamgirls for her birthday. And here it is. I get this call. And I didn't know what I thought. And Margie was coming to see me. So I had to be the one to tell Margie about Jane, which I don't even remember what I think I just said Jane died. And it was just a complete and total utter shock. And I don't remember her funeral. I remember flying home with Margie. I do remember somebody said to me, in the Jewish religion, you sit shiva for a week and people come over and they bring all this food, which I think is such a ridiculous thing. And she said to me, don't worry, there's going to be a time, and don't feel bad. You're going to forget your sister. And that haunted me for 30 years. So after like 5 days, my father sent me back to New York, and I was in retail in the height of the Christmas season. And I don't even remember that whole time period. I don't even remember the first couple of months. And I just, was in work and was worrying about it. And Margie started to go on a decline. And I just kind of powered through. And I was living in New York. My mother was, had a terrible time. And Margie started to decline. And I came back, as much as I could to Boston. And, I just kept going on this fast treadmill and never looked back.
Yeah. I call it the fog, when you're going back in. And I remember for myself, as I've shared with all of you, it was that first year, it was such a fog. You sharing the comment of you'll forget your sister, that was a fear for me too. That's very real. And I'm sure a lot of people listening to this can understand that as well. I was living in so many different emotions for the first 5 years until I created the podcast. I'm going to forget this detail. I'm going to forget that, or I'm going to forget the little things and the big things. And I thought I was going to forget things. And that's why it was so important for me to tell my story, his story. And I felt kind of rushed to do it. So I really understand that. And the things people say to you, oh my gosh, we could do a whole episode on that, because people don't understand grief. And they don't understand how to connect with people during grief. That's a big issue.
What I do remember is, I think when I came back to New York, is scurrying around and putting together, they had, I'm dating myself. Don't forget, this is 1981. They had those lucite frames that they were 11 by 14, and they had different cutouts of different shapes, like a square, a triangle, a rectangle, and cutting out pictures and making this collage of pictures, frantic, looking for pictures. Because after that woman said that, I was frantic, I'm going to forget her, and I never wanted to forget her.
Yeah, I think that's a great message just about grief in general. And, these things stick with us. They stick with us. It's not just the parents that are impacted. The siblings are impacted too. And hearing things like that, Judy, it haunted you. I get that, because there's things people said to me as well. And I'm sure people listening will be nodding or agreeing or thinking about that one thing that was said to them, or multiple things that kind of haunts them. And so I understand that completely. So Jane, you're so young too when Jane passes. Did you ever find out what exactly happened in her car accident?
I did. My parents never talked about it, and allegedly the car was malfunctioned. I figured it was something else. And after Margie died, I needed to find out. So I did go to the police and get the report. And it was speed. And, it wasn't just the car malfunctioning. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't change anything. But I felt I needed to know. And I think that, listen, Jane was Jane. She was a bit on the wild side. She was young. She and I were very different, but we loved each other. And when I moved, I found all these cards for her. And, I keep reading them over and over. And there was love there. And decades later, when I did go through the grief and I saw some of her friends, and they told me these stories about her, because I had blocked, I didn't remember how they would go through my room and go through my things and rearrange them, because she never thought I was cool enough. I was banished for her sweet 16 when I came home from college, but that's sisters, you fight like cats and dogs 1 minute, and then you're lovey-dovey, you forgot it 2 minutes later, but that's what sisters do. But there's always that immense love. Jane was Jane, but she was fun, and she was, she thought she was so cool. And, I was kind of the I was the kind of nerdy one or whatever. So she never thought I was cool enough, but she had a great smile, she was a lot of fun. That's who she was.
Yeah, you guys kind of fit the archetypes like perfectly of like eldest, middle, and youngest.
Right.
And the youngest is always kind of carefree. Like you guys have paved the way for the youngest. They can kind of just be fun and energetic, party a little, all of that. And that's what Jane, like I could really envision her when I was listening to your book. And also as you have described her in our conversations. And now I have a younger sister. She's 10 years younger than me. I have two sisters, but it's interesting because Jane reminds me of her a little bit. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so interesting. As sisters, I connect. And I think we've said this before too, but there's not a lot of stories out there about the loss of a sister. So the fact that you're sharing both of these stories, I think is just so incredible. But it's interesting how each one of you kind of fits that archetype that people think of. So yeah, you're absolutely right too. With Jane, an accident is an accident, doesn't really matter. But I can connect, and I think a lot of people listening can connect as well, to wanting to know. Some people don't want to know. Some people want to know. It's a personal choice, I feel like, when you're going through things. But it's interesting that happened for you when Margie passed. So can you kind of walk us through Margie's path and journey? I know she struggled for many, many years.
Yeah. So Margie got sick when I was 14, and coincidentally, that's the year we all moved, and we each got our own room. And I kind of liked it that I shared a room with Jane, because there's nothing like sharing a room. You're in that closeness that you can't, once our room was separated, and Margie had a medical illness, so she didn't want to go away to overnight camp. So I went by myself. And then I remember the year Janie came, I was so excited because I got to ride the sister bus, and, she came to me and cried at camp. I love that, having a little sister. And Margie was my idol. She was, popular. She was a cheerleader. And, she was like, I idolized her. I mean, she would call me Lipson, and like whatever she said, she jumped and I said, how high? We'd always rearrange her room. And I just, idolized her. And she could read me, even when she was at her sickest, lowest point, she could read me. She knew me like nobody else. But it was very hard having a sister with a mental illness, as I'm sure many people can relate. And you never know the highs, you never know the lows. And it was very, very challenging. So she got sick when I was 14 years old. So, and then, this was, in the 70s, people then didn't really talk about it. And it was very, very hard to go through it. And I always knew at some point, that she lived as long as she lived was kind of a miracle. But I always knew at some point we were going to lose her, but it's still, losing her was very, very hard. And I'll never forget the day.
And she was 35 when
she was 35.
Wow. Yeah. Now, I just want to take it back for a second, Judy. So, so she struggled for, basically 2 decades.
20 years, yeah.
Yeah. And, I'm sure there's lots of people that can relate to this too. She struggled with anorexia. That was her main struggle, or were there additional things that she struggled with?
Anorexia and bulimia.
Yeah. That is really difficult. And that's a difficult thing to watch. And I can't imagine going through that for 20 years. So do you think that it seems like Jane's passing probably impacted her, and probably impacted her mental illness and her anorexia and bulimia, I would imagine. Do you think that, or what was your take on that?
I think it had gone on for a lot of years, but I think it also, we never talked about Jane's death, but I'm sure that A, losing her sister, and B, I'm sure she sensed that, everybody thought it was her and not Jane, when everybody got the phone call. So I'm sure that layered into it. So she definitely went on a downward spiral, but, she died 9 years later. So, she definitely went on a downward after that. She didn't have any upwards, for times she would have some leveling off periods, and she never had one after that.
Yeah. So it's definitely safe to say, it impacted her.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that when I first asked that question too. But yeah, people assuming that it was her, that's got to be a deep hit to you when you're thinking about that. Like, wow. So I know it's difficult to talk about it, but this was in 1990 when she passed, what happened where it was the illness finally, unfortunately, took Margie? What was the kind of the pinnacle of that?
Yeah, her body just shut down.
Was she living by herself? Was she living at home?
Yeah, she was in the hospital and she just, shut down.
Wow. And so what was that like for you? Because initially 9 years before, you thought it was her, but it was Jane. And now you did get that call. You did receive that information. So how was that for you?
I felt so alone. I remember perfunctory making the few phone calls I had to make. And I wasn't a mother when Jane died. I was a single mother of 2 small children when Margie died. And I just felt so alone. And at the Shiva house, I went upstairs and nobody came, nobody even noticed that I was gone. And the rabbi, just mentioned my name, didn't even acknowledge. He focused only on her illness, not even her as a person. Or me losing a sibling or that we had lost Jane. It was just so awful and cold. And I just couldn't wait. My girls were with a babysitter till they came over to kind of break that up. But not one person even noticed that I wasn't there. And I just remember feeling so alone at that point.
Of course she felt alone. Wow. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And then it was kind of who am I now? I mean, my sisters were my anchors, and the favorite picture that I have is on a slide that I use for the celebration, and I'm squashed in between them, the middle one. And they're both in flip-flops. I'm in sneakers. They're in sleeveless. I'm in short sleeve. I'm the different, but that picture solidifies who I was. I'm the middle of 3. And I used to say, who am I? But that's who I am. I'm the middle of 3. I'm squashed between them. And now what,
I love that. Thank you for sharing about that picture. And yeah, I know it's really hard to share both of these stories, but I think that's really interesting how you kind of are sharing about each passing with Margie and also with Jane, because what happens for us as siblings, as you know, and this is what you're describing, well, first, you changed in the family dynamic because you lost your younger sister. So now it's you and Margie. So you're the younger sister, but you're not, right? Jane lived. Jane is your sister. And then you lose Margie and now you're an only child. No, you're not. You had an older sister. You have an older sister is what I'd like to say. And I can completely understand why you would feel so alone in those moments. That's very dark time and a dark, quote unquote, celebration. Didn't really sound like one to me, but it really shifts who you are physically, right? Because they're not physically here anymore. And now you have 2 daughters as well. So I'm sure it really hit you, Judy.
Well, one of my daughters is named for Jane. So that's really nice. And it was kind of I went through this. I would meet people and they'd say, of course, that question, how many siblings do you have? And I would choke. I'd hold my breath. What do I say? How do you answer that question? And I just say it's me. So people didn't even know that I had 2 sisters. And I just couldn't go through it. And now I just say, I'm the middle of 3. And sadly, I lost both my sisters, period. Because I'm always going to be the middle of 3. They're still a part of me. They always are going to be a part of me. That's never going to change. Physically, they're not here, but they are. They're always going to be part of me. But I think it's such a horrible, difficult question for us to answer.
I love that you're bringing this up. I hear this all the time in groups. I'm sure you do as well. How do you handle this question? And I connect with you so much on this, and I'm sure a lot of other people are going to connect on this as well. But, that question, it really evolved for me too, Judy, because it really wasn't until, probably about 2 years ago or so. I mean, I shared it on the podcast that I finally started to say, but I would dread it when people would get to know me or, I was on a meeting or whatever, because I run businesses and people would say, oh, well, tell me about your family. I'm I would become stone, I'm so fair anyway, but I'm sure I became completely like a ghost whenever this question was asked, right? And there were times when I would do something very similar to you. I would say something like, I'm the oldest of four, and like pray they wouldn't ask. And like I was kind of testing the waters of different things. And then there were some times where I was just like, oh yeah, I have two sisters. And like that would feel icky to me because that's not true. And I was really proud of myself when I got to a place, this was not that long ago, to be able to say, oh yeah, I'm the oldest of four. And they would ask, oh, do you have sisters, brothers? And I would say I have two sisters and I have a brother who has passed. And then I had to brace myself because reactions were always different, but you kind of have to find your own language that works for you, don't you think?
Absolutely. And then like when you go on a date and you're meeting a guy for the first time, like, what do? Do you say something? Is this a test? Like, how do you do it and how the reaction is? And, you know, some people just don't know how to respond to grief or sadness. And, you know, you can't fault them. But I think in this situation, it's all what you're comfortable saying. And like you said, it evolves and it's what you're comfortable with or whatever. And it took me decades to get to be comfortable to say this because the question would come and I could feel myself. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. What am I going to do? Hold my breath. I can't answer this. What am I going to say? And now, you know, 40 years later, I'm finally comfortable saying something. So, you know, everybody has to find their place and comfort. And it might be different what you say to one person versus another person.
Great point. I'm glad you brought that up because that's so true. And when you were talking about, what you said to one person, like you kind of have to find your boundaries with it, right? Like if you feel you're in a safe place and you want to share, like go for it. It just evolves, like we were saying. But I love that you shared about the date because that's so true. I lost my brother in 2016. I didn't meet my husband until 2018. And I'll never forget, you know, going on dates in between and then meeting him. And I remember telling him and like the deep empathy that he showed me. I don't know, it can be a positive thing, but you know, every situation is different. But I was at a place where I was ready to start to share, not with the world, but with someone important. So I understand that. But I think what's really important to share about your story, Judy, is not just, you know, about, you know, Jane's accident and losing Jane and then losing Margie after 2 decades of, you know, a battle with something that so many people struggle with and silently. It's horrible. But your story is so interesting. So after Margie passed and, you know, you had this very cold experience and you're a single mom and you've got the girls, your grief journey was kind of stunted from what we've talked about and what I've read in the book and listened to in the book. So if you wouldn't mind, walk us through a little bit, because I think it's really inspirational that you moved through life and went on this grief journey and then really kind of put your heels in and dealt with your grief and processed it. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that with us, I think it's an important story to tell.
Yeah, so Margie died in 1990 and I was, you know, a single mother working full time. And especially after Margie died, the girls and I became my parents' focus. And it was a lot of pressure. And I felt like I had to bring sunshine to their lives. And I was on this treadmill that I just kept going. And my grief kept getting pushed further and further down. Of course, you know, I'd get these tsunamis, you know, I'd be driving and all of a sudden I would burst into tears. And in the Jewish religion, we have the American anniversary, we have the Jewish anniversary, and then we have on Yom Kippur, the Yizkor service. So we have all these, you know, anniversaries that would come up. And the anxiety building up to those dates would be horrific, especially the Yizkor service, where my mother doesn't go to temple. I'd have to go with my father. As soon as they'd start this service, I would become sobbing that I couldn't see to walk out of the temple. Thank God our seats were near the exit. I mean, like sobbing, like could barely walk out. So that was like my grief. So my quote grief, so to speak. And then my father got very sick with an illness that sort of mimicked ALS. And then my best friend was dying of lung cancer. And so these were my peeps that I spoke to every single day, and my father especially. And, I'd gone to therapy on and off. And, they kept saying, you've got to deal with this grief. And I knew my father's loss was going to be huge, another huge void in my life. So I decided that I better start dealing with the grief of my sisters. So in 2011, which was 30 years, I decided, and in tandem with that, I decided that I wanted to do something to honor my sisters, which I started the fundraiser, which I'll talk about a little later. And it was probably the hardest thing I had to do in my life, but probably the best gift that I started. So I had seen a therapist right after Jane died, and she sat there and scribbled on the paper and didn't look up at me once. And I didn't go back. And then my parents dragged me to Compassionate Friends, which is a wonderful organization. And everybody in the room told their stories. And I wasn't ready to receive it. And I never went back. I wish I had, because, in truth, I really needed it. Mm-hmm. And then in 2005, I went back, and there were more adults, and I was more receptive, and I was ready to hear it. And now I'm part of the book group, which I love. I read, and I'm an introvert. So groups really aren't for me. I think everybody has to find their own way. So in that group, I met somebody who said he went to a complicated grief study, and I went to one. And it was a very grueling 5 months. And I went through that, and it was digging deep, reliving the deaths, reliving the whole thing, and also trying a time for restoration, what makes you feel good, and doing a parallel of those. My daughter said to me during that time, she felt that grief defined me. And that really was an eye-opener, because here I felt like I was being the cheerleader and caretaker for everybody else. And that was a real soccer gun punch to me, because that really, really, really hurt me to the core. But of course, my parents never talked about my sisters, so I took the lead from them, and I never shared any of that with my daughters either. So it took a long time, and I also realized that taking care of me isn't selfish. I changed a lot, and I don't think my family was happy with me, because I started to take care of me instead of taking care of everybody else. And memories started to come back. I looked at pictures. I could start to talk about my sisters and share them and do the fundraiser. But it was really hard work, but also opening it up and sharing my story. And that's when people told me I should start to write my book. So here I am.
I was smiling the whole time you were telling that detail, which is in your book as well, about grief defining you and how your daughter told you that. I actually have that written down on my notes, because I think, that was such a standout for me in your story, and is a standout for me in your story, Judy, because I've had people tell me that don't really understand what I've gone through. They told me that grief was defining me. They're like, I don't want your brother's death to define you. I don't want your brother's, murder to define you, whatever, right? There's been multiple people that have told me this. And I ignored it because I felt like they weren't really understanding what I was going through, and they were not. But at the same point, there was truth in it. There absolutely was truth in it, because I rarely get emotional on this podcast. I'm emotional right now. Thanks, Judy. but this was true for me. And in listening to your book, that was like the thing that really stuck out. There's so many things that stuck out, but that was like, I felt like you were talking directly to me. I'm like, oh, Judy's caught me. Grief defined me too. Or your daughter's caught me. And that's part of the progression, and why I wanted to put my grief to work, is kind of what I changed my mindset to do. And you did the same thing. So let's kind of start to move into that. I really want to talk about this fundraiser, because little did I know that we had even more in common. But I want to talk about this, what you've done for sisters. It's so beautiful. And you did this in honor of Margie and Jane. But tell us a little bit about this. This started in, what was it, 2011 or 2012?
2011. Okay.
Yep.
I would just like to say one thing. I think grief doesn't define us. I think grief is part of us.
Thank you, Judy. We needed to hear that.
I think that's the difference. I think it's always going to be part of us. And I think that's the difference.
Beautifully said.
Okay.
Love that.
So in 2011, we've always been involved with philanthropy. So I wanted to do something to honor my sisters. So as girls, we always skated. Margie was a sensational skater. I was not so great. And Jane and I putted along. So we took, group lessons as girls. So I didn't want to have there's so many golf tournaments or races. And I didn't want to have like a boring, rubber chicken dinner, one of those fundraisers. So my sisters were fun. And, I was going to have like something with dance. But then I thought, because I had gone back to skating the year before. And I thought, let's do a skating fundraiser. Okay. So I started this fundraiser and one of my friends came up with the idea Celebration of Sisters. So it benefits Mass General Hospital, where we've all received wonderful care. And actually, Margie had like a bladder operation there when she was like 8. And, she'd been to one of the doctors there had taken care of her when she first got sick with the anorexia. So it just like made sense to go there. So we started with 10 skaters and 50 people in the audience. I was a recreational skater, never performed in my life. And I go out there and I perform. So the first 2 years I did it with a partner. And then at 58, I did a solo. And it grew to 10 years. It was 92 skaters and close to 200 people in the audience. And we've raised close to $80,000 for Mass General Hospital.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank you. So it's just the amount of people that come and support it. Margie's friends come, a few of Jane's friends come. And I have it in November because Jane's birthday is November 6th. She died on the 7th. And Margie's birthday is November 8th. And my birthday is in October. And that's the last time I saw Jane was to celebrate my birthday. So, and you have the Jewish holidays. So it's like a yucky time of the year for me. So I always have it the first weekend in November. So it gives me a way to focus on something else other than the anniversaries. So the 10th year, because of COVID, was last year, which was 2021. And then that was going to be the grand finale. And so this year I felt funny. I said, well, let's try it one more year. And we didn't have the show. We just had like an open skate. And I think it's going to be the end. We're going to do something else. I don't know yet. Stay tuned. But it was a beautiful ride and it was a beautiful way to honor my sisters. And I'm just so grateful to everybody who supported it, to the skaters, to the donors, to everybody who was involved with it. It was just such a beautiful way to honor such beautiful girls.
Yeah, I just thank you again for sharing this. And I think it's a beautiful way to honor. And I think it's a huge success. It was a decade long, raised $80,000. That's huge. And tell us the final count. How many skaters you had and how many people were in the audience at the end? I love hearing this.
We had 92. I think we had close to 200 people.
And how many skaters?
92.
That's awesome. Were you guys all on the rink at one time? I think I remember listening to something in the book about all of you kind of coming onto the rink at a certain time.
Yeah, so we had several synchronized skating teams. So the opening was always to Over the Rainbow. And then the finale is to Up, Up, and Away. And everybody skates out with a balloon. So at the opening and the finale, everybody skates out together.
That's so incredible. Like, I just thought it was really important that we tell kind of your beginning and then the evolution and how it grew. And that made me very emotional, like listening to that on your book and your story.
And when I choose a song, I try to, like a couple of years, it fell on Margie's birthday or Jane's birthday. So when I moved, I sold my house and I moved to Boston. I found cards and letters of Margie and Jane, but I also found 33s that were intact, which we used to have like stickers with our names on them, like neon stickers. And I didn't realize like both my sisters were Carole King fans. So like I skated to Beautiful to honor them. And I know Margie liked Downtown. So I skated to Downtown when it was on her birthday. So I tried to be like, think of songs that meant music to, provided I could skate to it, to skate to them, to honor them as well.
I love that. I love that the introverted sister ended up creating this successful fundraiser with And it grew. That's amazing. And yes, we will stay tuned to see what you come up with next, because celebrating sisters is important. And there's a lot of you listening that have lost a sister. So we hear a lot. There's a lot of stories that have been shared about the loss of a brother, like we were talking about earlier, Judy. But these stories of losing our sister are very important. And I love what you're doing for the community. So tell me a little bit about, let's go into sharing your story, because you really opened up and bared it all in your book. So tell us a little bit about that journey and about your book, because your book came out quite recently compared to, the losses of your sister. So tell us a little bit about that journey.
In 1999, we started a fund in Mass General, and the doctor said to me, you should really write about these girls. We really know who they are. And I'm like, yeah, put it in the back burner. So after my father died, I went to a support group for people who had lost their fathers. And the social worker said to me, you need to write your story. You need to tell your story. And I'm like, yeah, right. And so she had me write an article for Grieve magazine that was published. And then I wrote some articles for the Open to Hope Foundation. And, writing is kind of, for introverts, you kind of think things and process them down. So it's kind of a nice venue to kind of get your thoughts out there. And for somebody who hadn't shared their feelings, it was kind of a nice way to kind of get your thoughts out there. And then, people had just said to me, you need to tell your story. You need to tell your story. And I'm just being such a private person. I just, I said, no, I can't do this. But I felt it was important because I just wanted to help somebody else I didn't want anybody else to feel alone like I did. So I felt it was important. And going through my own therapy, and now that I was starting to share my sisters and with celebration, that it was time to do a book. So in 2018, I left my job. I said, all right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to write the book. The day I left the job, that's when I fell and got a concussion.
My
on the ice. But through listening to podcasts is how I found my writing coach. So, things happen,
Yes.
So, everybody says always in the book, catharsis isn't a closure. And I hate that word closure. It makes me insane.
Me too,
it makes
Judy,
me say, I hate it. I get shakes. It wasn't. It was something that I felt I needed to do for others. And writing the parts about the girls' deaths was very, very hard. I had never written before. I had never written a memoir. I went through probably 20 drafts. I had a village to help me, a lot of editors, a lot of developmental editors. I went with a hybrid publisher. I'm just so grateful to them, Right Life Publishing, that published it for me, and the team of editors that helped me. And all along the way, it took a village, but I felt that it needed to be out there. And because there's not a lot out there, as we know, about sibling loss. And I think the more people share their stories, then, can help somebody else, then I'll be very grateful. And that's why I wrote it.
Yeah, I agree. There's more coming out. Thank goodness. More books, more podcasts, more information,
right.
More groups, which is great. And, that's wonderful, but we can always use more stories. And the thing about your story, Judy, is it's a multi-loss story. And it's a sister story. And there's not a lot out there for those niche loss areas, in addition to sibling loss. So if you're a sibling that's gone through a loss, but you've lost multiple siblings, and then you lost your father. So there's a lot of different angles and aspects to what you've done. And it's an absolutely beautifully written book. So I understand it takes a village. I get it. It takes a village with the podcast too, but writing is a whole different ballgame. And I understand, and I just commend you for that. But I want to go back to something you said at the beginning about people saying, was it cathartic? Did it give you some closure? I cannot tell you, Judy, we connect so much, because I cannot tell you how many times people ask me that myself. They've asked me after season 2 a little bit, but more after season 1, right? Like you telling your story through the book, me telling the story through this podcast. Those are the number 1 and 2 things that I hear. Was it cathartic for you? Was it cathartic? If I had $1 for every time, all of us surviving siblings would be getting on a jet and going somewhere, because everybody asked me that. And I think I've shared this before, but I just want to share it in our conversation, because I think you'll connect with this. There's not one word to describe what this journey has been like for me. sure, there were a few moments of it being cathartic because I felt like, oh, I'm not going to forget my brother because I said all these things and it's documented now. But I'm working through it and, realizing where I was. But I felt sad, happy, mad. Like it was so many different emotions going on, reliving it. And I'm sure you connect with that. But I finally had to come up with, like, what am I going to tell people? And I looked at one of my really good girlfriends, one that really kind of gets what I'm going through. And I looked at her. And by the way, she works corporate retail too. We have that in common, which we'll come back to. But I looked at her, I said, this is what it feels like. It feels like I've been carrying around all my belongings, like all the luggage I could possibly, like everything I could pack. And then I finally was able to set it down. And she looked at me and she just got it. And I was like, okay, if she gets it, maybe other people will get it. That's what it felt like to me. And that like analogy or comparison works for me because in carrying all of that for a long time, you get tired, you get sad, you feel pain, and being able to just set it down. I wouldn't call that cathartic, but I would kind of call it like, it's out there now. It's a release. It's not closure, like your baggage is still with you. It's still sitting there, but you don't have to carry it that same way anymore. That's how I felt. Does that resonate with you at all, Judy? Because
no, I think that's a very, very good analogy. And people don't understand that,
But I love that you hate the word closure too, because as I say all the time, there's no such thing as closure. There's the answers that we need to enable us to move forward.
And you never know how it's going to affect you every day. And you just have to go with it and feel it. And I think that I didn't allow myself to feel those feelings. And today, like, if it happens, like, I go with it. So I just had a new grandson and I had another grandson. And when my first grandson was born, for some reason or other, I got back on the ice and I started to get that shaky, like with me, I know like that it's going to come, like my body starts to shake. I'm like, oh no, this is it. I'm coming. This is my grief. My body starts to shake. And I started to cry and I thought, what is wrong? Because this is like what I had when Jane died. Like, what is wrong with me? And it's like, because I went from like such sadness to such joy, but like where there's grief, there's love. And like, it's okay to feel both, the sadness and the joy, but there's the love and that's what binds us. But I couldn't imagine, like I had to get off the ice and I couldn't figure it out. But when I got home, I thought, yeah, that's why. Because I felt such love for this new grandchild. And now I just had another one. And it's like, wow, but it's giving yourself like, that's okay,
I really love that you shared that because our body does do physical things and paying attention to that is really important. Isn't that interesting how that happened for you? Wow. And I think that's an important message to share here on the podcast. And I know you share a lot of that in the book too, I remember. And it's interesting how our bodies will react to that, but it's still love. It's still love that you have for your sisters. Now it's love that you have for your grandsons. Congratulations. That's so beautiful. And I feel that new life can sometimes trigger grief in some ways too, because it does make us think about that. Did you have that experience, Judy? I hear that from people sometimes.
When my grandsons were born?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, because it's kind of like, I wish my sisters were here and my kids, they're going to have cousins that, I didn't have and all that. So you feel it, you feel the loss. I mean, you feel the joy and you feel the loss and, the what ifs and you wanting them here with it. And yeah, it's a milestone that they're not celebrating with you.
Yeah. And I just think it's so important. And I want to thank you for bringing that up and being so honest about that because it's this wonderful, beautiful thing that's happening in your life, but it can be a trigger for a lot of people. I've heard that in groups. I've, heard that from people that have just talked to me about their grief. And it's a happy thing that's happening in your life. But of course, it's something we carry for life. We're missing parts of us. But, it's helped me to realize, my brother's still with me and honoring him. And you are definitely honoring your sisters with your incredible book and fundraiser. And I'm just looking forward to seeing what you do next because I just love everything. And I want to say this, we grew up skating as well. And so in the book, I don't want to give too much about the book away because I want everyone to read it. But when you're talking about getting your Rydell skates, I like shrieked. Like I was like, this is so awesome. And anyone who skates will connect with this too. because I still have skates in my closet. I still have Rydell skates, and I haven't been on the ice in a long time because I got in an accident, unfortunately. But I instantly connected, and I like went back to that time when like me and my sister and my brothers, before my other sister was born, you know, all would go and put our skates on and take the garters off the skates. Like, I so connected with everything you were saying. And there's a lot of this in the book, so I don't want to give it away, but I had to tell you that I just loved that part. And I love how you carried that into the fundraiser. That's incredible.
Well, I hope someday you'll be able to skate again.
Yeah. You know, I think so. You know, it's been a journey, right? In my own rehab after my accident, but I'm here, I'm alive, and that's what matters. And I'm doing workouts again. So that's positive. So yes, one day I will get on the ice again, maybe in the next year, fingers crossed, 2023, here we come. Right.
I'm counting the minutes till I can go back. I can't.
And I love this about you. I love this. I love that this is like such an outlet for you. And it's a really positive thing. You have done so much on your journey, Judy. And, you know, I really want to ask you the question I ask, you know, everyone who comes on here, and everyone has a different answer. If you could go back to Judy in 1981 and Judy in 1990, what is something you would tell yourself, and obviously tell our incredible audience, about that time? The wisdom that you have so many years later and all that you've done. And after going through this grueling study that you share in your book about in more detail, thank you for sharing today about that. It was intense, what you went through. That was commitment. But what would you tell yourself in those losses? If there's any piece of advice that you could give yourself?
2 pieces of advice is, number one, is to reach out with somebody. I wish I had one person, at least one person to talk to, like another sibling who had lost a sibling. So at least I had somebody to share my grief with. Actually, 3 things. Number 2 is to talk about my siblings, because I think people wanted to talk about them, even my sister's friends. And I shut everybody out because I didn't think, you know, shut people out because I didn't want to talk about them. So talk about my sisters. And number 3, allow myself to feel. So, and not shut myself out. I put up walls and let those walls down and let myself feel and let people in. So those would be my 3 things.
Great advice, of course, coming from Judy. Or should I call you Lipson? Lipson? Great advice. I agree completely. And I think a lot of introverts are going to connect with this episode, with your book and your journey, Judy, because I do feel like, you know, we all define ourselves in certain ways, but we all have extroverted moments, introverted moments. You're kind of going through your extroversion right now with your skating and you're sharing your story. And I love that, but you're ultimately an introvert. And so I think a lot of introverts will connect with your story. And I think that's kind of a default mode for introverts to kind of shut down. But also I think what's so important to point out about your story is your parents. You were following the social cues from your parents. They weren't talking about it. So you were like, we don't talk about this, right? And I think everyone processes in their own way. And you don't know, right, as a child or a young adult. And you don't know if that's really the way that you want to process it. You're kind of following along in what you're seeing. So reading and listening to podcasts like this and other people's stories, I think is important because then you find your way in grief.
Yes. And I think there's no cookie cutter for grief. Everybody has to find what works for them. And took me 3 tries for Compassionate Friends. And now I'm in the book group and that works for me. And groups might not be for somebody, but by going, you might find one person that you can connect with. And like you said, there's podcasts. There's a lot more out there today than there was in 1981. And I'm so grateful for that, for all the siblings. So it's what works for you. And like I say in my book, it's never too late to grieve. So even if you have to pocket it for a year or pocket it for 2 years or pocket it for a month, it's your journey and whatever works for you. That's what's important.
Yeah, I agree. You know, going to group and having people on this podcast and being in different Facebook groups. I mean, there's so many more resources. We have a long way to go, to your point. But compared to 1981, absolutely. Like we're making it happen, Judy. Thank goodness, right? But I love that you're giving permission for everyone to just understand that because you grieved a certain way and I grieved a certain way, that's not going to be your exact journey, and to just really give yourself some grace. And I never really understood what that meant before going through a grief journey, but it's what you said earlier in the podcast, putting yourself first. And some people might not like that, but you know what? That's their issue. Putting yourself first is going through your grief journey. That's a part of the journey because you're tapping into yourself. So again, love that you shared that and wanted to go back to that for a second, because I never really understood what people were talking about. I was like, put myself first, give myself grace. Like, what are you talking about? I'm having to deal with my family and deal with this tragic loss and deal with work and deal. But I never put the focus on myself.
Yeah. And there's a lot of great, books out there now, and taking care of yourself is also really important. Whatever that means for you, if it means going for a walk or, kind of writing in a journal, whatever, taking time out of the day for you and taking care of you. Because I think, especially as siblings, we tend to take care of everybody else, our parents, kids, other family members, that we get kind of pushed to the back seat. And I think it's very important that we try to take care of ourselves.
I agree. And I wish someone had told me that. So hopefully all of you listening will take that memo. And when people did tell me that, I didn't really understand it. And you're saying it beautifully, Judy. It's really about doing something that you enjoy doing and doing something healthy for yourself. And if it's going for a walk in nature, if it's watching a show that makes you laugh, if it's reading a book that's going to make you feel connected to the sibling community, whatever it is, do it. I was in the Compassionate Friends group earlier this month. I think I shared that with you. And there were a few people in there that had just lost their siblings. And that was something we talked about. I was like, what is something you like to do? We were connecting with them and kind of telling them to put themselves, first. And they were in what I like to call the fog, right? Like, it was fresh. It is fresh for them. And it's something as simple, like one of the young ladies in the group, she's like, well, there's a book I've really wanted to read. And I'm like, great. She goes, and I'd really like to have a glass of wine while I, read the book. And I'm like, if it's in a healthy way, go for it. That's you time. Do something for yourself. And that's just a great example of, it's hard because you're in the fog, but taking care of yourself and doing things that you enjoy, that's what's going to bring you joy. That's what's going to bring you kind of in the present moment. At least that's what I have found.
That's great. Great idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Judy, I loved your book. I love what you've done for over a decade for your sisters. Can't wait to see what happens next. You're part of Compassionate Friends too. So we're going to put that link in here as well, because I've referred people to that group too. I think it's wonderful. There's local chapters. You can go in person. There's a lot of virtual as well happening, more in person now. But like you said, if you're an introvert, you prefer, connecting maybe on Facebook groups. It's all out there, which is wonderful. Judy, tell us where we can find your book though.
Okay. You can go to my website, www.judylipson.org.
Fabulous. And tell us the full name of your book again.
It's Celebration of Sisters. It is never too late to grieve.
I love that. I absolutely love your mantra. It's never too late to grieve. I feel like a lot of us as surviving siblings have that mantra because we're on the journey together. So Lipson, thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate you sharing your story and sharing your book and being so raw and open with us.
Thank you for having me. It was an honor.
Thank you so much, Judy.
Thank you so much for listening to the Surviving Siblings podcast. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did creating it for you, then share it on your chosen social media platform. And don't forget to tag us at Surviving Siblings Podcast so that more surviving siblings can find us. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. And don't forget to follow us on all social media platforms. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Surviving Siblings Podcast. All links can be found in the show notes, so be sure to check those out too. Thank you again for the support. Until the next episode, keep on surviving, my surviving siblings.